The blizzard howled like the voices of the damned, each gust carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of unanswered prayers. Caleb Morrison pressed his scarred palm against the frost-covered window of his cabin, watching the snow swirl in violent spirals across the barren landscape of Bitterpine Valley. The cold bit through the glass, but it was nothing compared to the ice that had settled in his chest the night Sarah and Thomas disappeared. He could still see their faces in his mind. Sarah's bright laugh as she chased fireflies behind their old homestead, Thomas barely walking, but determined to follow his sisters everywhere. The memory twisted like a knife. 3 years since Marshal Creed's men had found their bodies in the ravine, 3 years since the official report claimed wolves had gotten them. 3 years since Caleb had started seeing the lies beneath Bitterpine's veneer of frontier justice. The scratching came first, desperate, weak, like claws against wood. Then the thud of something heavy collapsing against his door. Caleb's hand instinctively moved to the Colt at his hip as he peered through the crack in the shutters. What he saw made his blood freeze. A girl no more than 16 lay crumpled in the snow. Her feet were bare and bleeding, leaving crimson tracks that the wind was already beginning to erase. But it was the mark on her shoulder that made Caleb's breath catch a brand still weeping, shaped like a twisted cross, the same symbol he'd seen carved into the tree where they'd found Sarah and Thomas. The girl's eyes found his through the shutter crack. They were dark, haunted, filled with a terror so profound it seemed to reach across the space between them and grip his heart. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. She tried to crawl toward the door, her fingers leaving desperate scratches in the ice. That's when Caleb saw the riders emerging from the white curtain of snow. 3 of them, faces hidden behind makeshift masks cut from burlap sacks. The lead rider carried a lasso, the rope singing as he spun it overhead. Even through the storm, Caleb could see the deliberate way they approached. This wasn't a rescue. This was a hunt. "Found you, little mouse." The lead rider called his voice, carrying an accent Caleb recognized but couldn't quite place. The lasso flew through the air, settling around the girl's legs with practiced precision. She clawed at the snow as the rider began to drag her away from the cabin, her silent mouth open in what should have been a scream. Caleb's door exploded outward in a shower of splinters. The Winchester in his hands spoke twice in rapid succession, the bullets cutting the rope and sending the lead rider's horse rearing in panic. The masked man fought to control his mount, and in that moment of struggle, his mask slipped. Jonas Pike. Caleb's stomach dropped like a stone down a well. He'd known Jonas since they were boys, had shared drinks with him at Murphy's Saloon, had even considered him a friend, before the man had disappeared for months and returned wearing a deputy's badge and dead eyes. Jonas. Caleb's voice carried across the howling wind. "What in God's name are you doing?" For a moment, Jonas hesitated. His hand moved to pull the mask back up, but his eyes, cold, vacant, like a man sleepwalking through a nightmare, never left the girl. "Orders, Caleb. She's dangerous. Step aside." "Dangerous." Caleb levered another round into the Winchester's chamber. "She's barely alive." The other 2 riders had circled around trying to flank him. Caleb recognized the maneuver, classic Creed tactics. Pin the target, eliminate witnesses, control the narrative. He'd seen it before, the night his children died. "Last warning, Morrison." Jonas called. His voice held no warmth, no recognition of their shared history. "Marshal's orders are clear. Anyone harboring the branded girl dies with her." Caleb's answer came in the form of another Winchester shot that sent Jonas's hat spinning into the snow. The other riders opened fire, their bullets splintering the doorframe around him as he dragged the girl inside and slammed the door. She lay unconscious on his floor, her breathing shallow and labored. Up close, the brand was even more horrifying, fresh, deliberate, infected. Someone had taken their time with it. The girl's clothes were torn rags, her dark hair matted with blood and dirt. But there was something else, something that made Caleb's chest tighten with recognition. Around her neck, nearly hidden beneath the grime, hung a small wooden cross, hand-carved, simple, with a tiny heart etched into its center. Sarah had worn one just like it. Outside, the riders were regrouping. Caleb could hear Jonas shouting orders over the wind, could see the flicker of torches being lit. They were preparing to burn him out. He had minutes, maybe less. The girl's eyes fluttered open. When she saw him, she tried to scramble away, her back pressing against the wall. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. But no sound emerged. Mute, either by nature or by trauma. Caleb had seen both in his time on the frontier. "Easy," he whispered, setting the Winchester aside and raising his hands. "I'm not going to hurt you." Her gaze darted to the door and then back to him. Slowly trembling, she pointed to the window. Then she drew a finger across her throat. The message was clear: they would kill them both. "What's your name?" Caleb asked. The girl's face crumpled with frustration. She looked around desperately, then grabbed a piece of charcoal from the fireplace. With shaking hands, she wrote on the floor, "Sarah, Mara." Caleb repeated. "Pretty name. I'm Caleb." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. There was something familiar about her features, something that tugged at a memory he couldn't quite grasp. "Mara, what?" She hesitated, then added, "Pike." "Pike. The same name as Jonas." Caleb's mind raced. Brother and sister cousins. The family resemblance was there now that he looked for it. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn set to the jaw. But why would Jonas be hunting his own kin? A torch crashed through the window, setting the curtains ablaze. Time was up. "Can you walk?" Caleb asked. Mara nodded, though he could see the pain in her eyes as she struggled to her feet. Her left ankle was swollen, possibly broken. She wouldn't make it far in the snow. Caleb wrapped her in his winter coat and grabbed his rifle. "There's a root cellar out back. Hidden door under the woodpile. Can you make it that far?" She nodded again, her jaw set with determination that reminded him painfully of Sarah. His daughter had had that same stubborn courage, that same refusal to give up, even when the odds were impossible. They slipped out the back as the front of the cabin erupted in flames. The cold hit them like a physical blow, the wind driving snow into their faces with needle-sharp intensity. Caleb could hear Jonas shouting orders, could see torches moving around the perimeter. They had minutes before the riders would realize their quarry had escaped. The woodpile was buried under 3 feet of snow. Caleb dug frantically, his hands already numb with cold, until his fingers found the iron ring hidden beneath the logs. The cellar door opened with a protesting groan, revealing a black hole that seemed to swallow their whispered footsteps. "Down," he whispered. "All the way to the back wall. There's blankets and water." Mara disappeared into the darkness like a ghost. Caleb followed, pulling the door closed behind them, just as he heard Jonas's voice, closer now, calling his name. The cellar was cramped and cold, but it was dry and hidden. They would be safe here until the storm passed. Unless Jonas remembered that Caleb had always been clever about hiding places. In the darkness, he felt Mara's hand find his arm. Her fingers were like ice, but her grip was strong. She was trying to tell him something, her hand moving in deliberate patterns against his sleeve. Letters, he realized. She was spelling out words. THANKYOU. "Don't thank me yet," Caleb whispered back. "We're not safe." Her hand moved again. DANGER. Then after a pause, CHILDREN. Caleb's blood turned to ice water. What children? But before Mara could answer, they heard it, the sound of boots on snow getting closer. Jonas had found the woodpile. Dawn came like a reluctant witness, pale and cold, over the smoldering ruins of Caleb's cabin. From their hiding place in the cellar, they could hear the riders moving around above, searching. Jonas's voice carried clearly in the still air, giving orders with the mechanical precision of a man who had forgotten how to think for himself. "Burn it all," he was saying. "Every board, every nail. If they're hiding here, smoke them out. If they ran the cold, we'll finish them." Caleb felt Mara stiffen beside him. She'd been awake for hours, her body trembling with more than just cold. Every time he'd tried to tend to her wounds, she'd pulled away, her eyes wide with a terror that went deeper than physical pain. Whatever had been done to her, it had left scars that went all the way to her soul. But when the sun was fully up, and the sounds of searching had moved away from their hiding place, Mara began to draw. Using the charcoal from the fire and a piece of flat wood, she sketched with desperate urgency. Lines shaped symbols that meant nothing to Caleb at first. Then gradually, a picture emerged. A building. Square, simple, with a cross on top. The church. Below it, she drew another shape. A door leading down. Underground. She added stick figures, small ones, like children. Then she drew X's over them one by one until the page was covered with tiny crosses. Caleb's stomach lurched. "The children, they're under the church." Mara nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She pointed to herself, then drew another figure underground. She'd been there too. She'd seen it happen. "How many?" Caleb whispered. Mara held up both hands. "Close them. Open them again. 20. At least 20 children buried beneath Bitterpine's house of worship." The pieces began falling into place in Caleb's mind, like dominoes in a line. The missing children over the past few years. The official reports blaming wolves' accidents, runaways. Sarah and Thomas, found in that ravine, with the branded symbol carved into the tree above them. All of it orchestrated, all of it covered up by Marshal Creed and his hand-picked deputies. "You escaped," he said. It wasn't a question. Mara nodded. She drew again herself, climbing up through a narrow space. A ventilation shaft, maybe, or a crack in the foundation. She'd been small enough to squeeze through, smart enough to wait for the right moment. But she'd left others behind. "We have to tell someone," Caleb said. "The territorial governor, the federal marshals." Mara grabbed his arm, shaking her head violently. She drew again this time, showing stick figures with badges, all of them connected by lines. The corruption went deeper than just Creed and his immediate deputies. The entire power structure of Bitterpine was in on it. But why? What could drive men to murder children and bury them like animals? Mara's next drawing answered that question. She sketched bags marked with dollar signs. Then larger figures, men in suits, men with power. The children weren't just being killed. They were being sold, trafficked, used, until they were no longer useful. And then they were disposed of, buried beneath the very symbol of hope and sanctuary that should have protected them. Caleb felt bile rise in his throat. Sarah and Thomas. His beautiful, innocent children caught up in something so evil he could barely comprehend it. The official story about wolves had been a lie, but the truth was infinitely worse. "We're going to stop this," he said, his voice hard as winter iron. "All of it." Mara looked at him with those haunted eyes, and for the first time since he'd pulled her from the snow, she almost smiled. Almost. They spent the day hidden in the cellar, taking turns watching through cracks in the foundation while the other rested. Caleb's cabin was a total loss, reduced to a pile of charred timbers and ash. But the riders had moved on, confident that their quarry was either dead or long gone. Jonas had always underestimated Caleb's stubborn streak. As evening approached, Caleb made his decision. "We're going into town?" Mara's eyes went wide with fear. She shook her head violently. "Listen to me," Caleb said gently. "We can't run from this. If we try to leave Bitterpine, they'll hunt us down. If we hide, more children will die. The only way out is through." She pointed to herself, then made a slashing motion across her throat. They want to kill you because you know the truth. But that's exactly why we need to get you somewhere safe, somewhere public, where they can't just make you disappear." Mara considered this, then wrote on the wood. "Where?" "Murphy's saloon," Caleb said. "Old Murphy's no friend of Creed's. He's got principles and he's got friends. If we can get you in front of enough witnesses, tell your story." Mara tapped her throat, reminding him of her disability. "You don't need to speak," Caleb said. "You can draw. Show them what you showed me. Make them understand." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. It was dangerous, perhaps suicidal, but it was also their only chance. Together, they began to plan. The streets of Bitterpine were oddly quiet as Caleb and Mara made their way through the back alleys toward Murphy's saloon. A few windows showed lamplight, but most of the buildings were dark. It was too early for the usual evening crowd, too late for legitimate business. Perfect timing for what they had in mind. Mara had insisted on walking despite her injured ankle, her jaw set with determination that reminded Caleb more and more of his lost daughter. She'd wrapped herself in a spare coat he'd found in the cellar, the hood pulled up to hide her distinctive features. To any casual observer, she might have been just another frontier woman going about her business. But Caleb knew they weren't dealing with casual observers. Creed's network of informants was vast, and Jonas Pike seemed to have developed an almost supernatural ability to track his quarry. They would have to be fast, smart, and very lucky. Murphy's saloon sat at the corner of Main Street and Prospector's Row, its windows glowing with warm, yellow light. Caleb could hear voices inside, not the usual drunken revelry, but the low, serious tones of men discussing business. Good. The more witnesses, the better their chances. He was about to step up onto the boardwalk when Mara grabbed his arm. She pointed down the street, her eyes wide with alarm. 3 riders were approaching from the north, and their horses moving at a steady trot that spoke of men who knew exactly where they were going. Even in the dim light, Caleb could make out the lead rider's familiar silhouette. Jonas Pike, still wearing his deputy's badge, still hunting his own sister with the relentless focus of a man who'd sold his soul. "Back door," Caleb whispered. They slipped around the side of the building, staying in the shadows, between the saloon and the adjoining dry goods store. The back door of Murphy's was typically left unlocked, and the old Irishman trusted in the basic decency of his neighbors, a faith that was about to be put to the ultimate test. The door opened with barely a whisper. Inside Murphy's looked exactly as Caleb remembered: rough-hewn tables, a bar made from a single massive oak plank, and walls decorated with newspaper clippings and wanted posters. The clientele tonight was different than usual, though. Instead of the typical mix of miners, ranchers, and drifters, the room was filled with some of Bitterpine's most respected citizens. Doc Henley sat at a corner table, his medical bag beside his chair. Reverend Walsh occupied another table, his clerical collar stark white against his black shirt. Even Mayor Fitzgerald was present, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. All of them looked up as Caleb and Mara entered, their conversations dying away into uncomfortable silence. "Caleb Morrison," Murphy said from behind the bar, his Irish accent thick with tension. "Heard your place burned down. Terrible thing indeed." "Not an accident, Murphy," Caleb said. He pushed Mara's hood back, revealing her face to the room. Several men gasped at the sight of her injuries, the brand on her shoulder clearly visible through her torn clothing. "This is Mara Pike. She's got a story to tell you all." Doc Henley was already rising from his chair, his professional instincts overriding his caution. "Good Lord, child, what happened to you?" Mara looked around the room, taking in the faces of the men who represented Bitterpine's power structure. Then she moved to the center of the room and knelt down on the wooden floor. Using a piece of charcoal from Murphy's fireplace, she began to draw. The church came first, rendered with the simple lines of someone who had seen it from every angle. Then the underground chamber, the rows of small graves, the symbols carved into the walls. The men gathered around her, their faces growing paler with each additional detail. This This is fantasy. Mayor Fitzgerald sputtered. The delusions of a traumatized girl. Mara looked up at him with eyes that held depths of pain no child should ever know. Then she drew another picture, a man in a suit, standing over a small grave. The resemblance to Mayor Fitzgerald was unmistakable. The room erupted in angry voices. Some defended the mayor, others demanded explanations. But through it all, Caleb noticed that Doc Henley remained silent, his face pale as parchment. "Doc," Caleb said, "you know something about this." Henley's hands were shaking as he reached into his medical bag. For a moment, Caleb thought the man was going for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small wooden cross, identical to the one Mara wore around her neck. "I've been carving these for 3 years," Henley whispered. "Every time they brought me a child who didn't survive their procedures. I told myself I was just a doctor following orders, saving the ones I could. But I kept count. God help me, I kept count." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Mara's charcoal scratching against the floor. She was drawing names now, as many as she could remember. Sarah Morrison, Thomas Morrison. The letters were shaky, misspelled in places, but recognizable. Caleb's vision blurred with tears. His children's names written by a girl who had watched them die, who had been powerless to save them, but had somehow found the strength to remember them. "How many?" Reverend Walsh asked, his voice broken. Mara held up both hands, closed them, opened them again. 20. 20 children buried beneath the house of God, their bodies used as a foundation for corruption and evil. That's when the front door exploded inward. Jonas Pike stood silhouetted against the night, his deputy's badge gleaming in the lamplight. Behind him stood 2 other men, Harrison Thorne Creed's most trusted enforcer, and Deputy Mills, a young man whose eagerness to please had made him dangerous. All 3 had their guns drawn. Nobody move. Jonas said, his voice flat and emotionless. "By order of Marshal Jeremiah Creed, you're all under arrest for conspiracy against territorial authority." "Jonas," Caleb said, stepping between Mara and the armed men. "Look at her. Really look at her. Don't you recognize your own sister?" For just a moment, something flickered behind Jonas's dead eyes. His gun hand wavered, and his gaze fixed on Mara's face, with something that might have been recognition. "She's not my sister," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "My sister died in the Indian raid 5 years ago. This is just some crazy girl making up stories." Mara stood slowly, her eyes never leaving Jonas's face. She pulled down the collar of her shirt, revealing a small scar on her collarbone. Then she pointed to Jonas, and then to herself, then made a gesture like a knife cutting. The scar. Caleb understood now. A childhood accident, perhaps, or a shared experience that only siblings would remember. Mara was trying to break through whatever conditioning had turned Jonas into Creed's perfect weapon. "The day you fell off the barn roof," Doc Henley said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him, but his eyes were fixed on Jonas. "I stitched you both up that day. You and your little sister Mara. She cried the whole time, not because of her own cut, but because she was worried about you." Jonas's gun began to shake in his hand. No, that's not. She died. Creed told me she died." "Creed lied," Caleb said. "He's been lying about everything. The children, the murders, your sister. He took her, Jonas. He took her, and he did things to her that no child should ever endure. And then he made you hunt her down like an animal." Mara took a step toward Jonas, her hand extended. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming a word that only he could read. A name, perhaps, or a shared memory from their childhood. For a heartbeat, Jonas looked like a man waking up from a nightmare. His gun lowered, his face contorted with pain and confusion. "Mara, is it really you?" That's when Harrison Thorne made his move. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. Jonas staggered, a red stain spreading across his shirt, his gun falling from nerveless fingers. Thorn's smoking pistol was already swinging toward Mara. "I can't have you getting soft on us, Pike," Thorn said with a cruel smile. Marshal's orders were clear. Kill the girl, kill anyone who helps her. Caleb's Winchester came up fast, but not fast enough. Thorn's second shot shattered the window behind Mara's head, sending glass flying in all directions. The third shot would have killed her if Doc Henley hadn't tackled her to the floor at the last second. Then Murphy's saloon erupted into chaos. Reverend Walsh, despite his clerical collar, proved to be handy with the shotgun he kept behind the bar. His first blast caught Deputy Mills in the shoulder, spinning the young man around and sending him crashing into a table. Mayor Fitzgerald, perhaps trying to prove his innocence, or perhaps just swept up in the moment, grabbed a whiskey bottle and hurled it at Thorn's head. But it was Murphy himself who turned the tide. The old Irishman came over the bar like a man half his age, a wicked-looking shillelagh in his massive hands. He'd been fighting for Irish independence before coming to America, and he hadn't forgotten how to crack skulls for a righteous cause. Thorn went down hard, his gun skittering across the floor. Mills, wounded and bleeding, tried to crawl toward the door, but found his path blocked by Doc Henley, who had somehow produced a derringer from his medical bag. "Nobody else has to die tonight." Henley said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "But that's entirely up to you, gentlemen." Caleb knelt beside Jonas, who was conscious but fading fast. Blood frothed at the corners of his mouth and his breathing was labored. Mara crouched beside them, her hands hovering over her brother's wounds, as if she could heal them through touch alone. "I remember." Jonas whispered, his eyes fixed on Mara's face. "I remember the day we caught fireflies behind the house. You put them in a jar, but then you cried because they looked sad. So we let them go, and they lit up the whole field like stars." Mara's tears fell freely now, the first emotion other than fear that Caleb had seen from her. She took Jonas's hand and squeezed it tight. "Creed. He did things to my mind." Jonas continued, his voice growing weaker. "Made me forget. Made me think you were dead. But I remember now. I remember everything." He looked up at Caleb, his eyes pleading. "The others. There are more like me. Good men who've been broken, turned into weapons. You have to save them." "And where?" Caleb asked. "Where is Creed keeping them?" "The old mine." Jonas gasped. "Silver Creek Mine up in the hills. That's where they do the breaking. Where they made me forget my own sister." Outside, they could hear the sound of horses approaching. Lots of horses. Creed had finally decided to stop playing games. "We're a back door," Murphy said grimly. "All of you. There's a tunnel that leads to the old mine shaft behind the church. Built it during the Indian troubles, figured it might come in handy someday." "What about Jonas?" Mara looked up at Caleb, her eyes desperate. Jonas answered for himself, his voice barely a whisper. "Leave me. I'm done running. But Caleb, promise me something. Anything. When you stop Creed, when you expose all this, make sure people remember the children. All of them. They deserved better than what we gave them." The front windows of the saloon exploded inward as Creed's men opened fire from the street. Caleb grabbed Mara and pulled her toward the back door, following Murphy's broad back as the Irishman led them toward the hidden tunnel. Behind them, Jonas Pike smiled for the first time in 3 years and reached for Harrison Thorne's fallen gun. He had some sins to atone for and very little time left to do it. The last thing Caleb heard as they fled into the tunnel was the sound of Jonas's final stand, 6 shots fired in rapid succession, followed by silence. The tunnel beneath Bitterpine was older than the town itself, carved out of the living rock by the same miners who had first discovered silver in these hills. It was narrow, cramped, and pitch black, but it was also their only hope of reaching the church undetected. Murphy led the way with a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Behind him came Doc Henley, Reverend Walsh, and Mayor Fitzgerald, all of them moving with the desperate urgency of men who had finally chosen a side. Caleb brought up the rear with Mara, his Winchester ready for trouble that was sure to follow. "How far?" Caleb asked as they navigated a particularly narrow section of the tunnel. "Quarter mile, maybe less." Murphy replied without turning around. "Tunnel comes up in the church basement right behind the altar." Always thought it was ironic considering what we now know was happening down there. Mara suddenly stopped her hand grabbing Caleb's arm. She was staring at the tunnel wall where someone had scratched crude markings into the stone. Names, dates, messages. The desperate final words of children who had been dragged through this same passage to their deaths. The Sarah Morrison, age 7, "I love you, Papa." Caleb's knees nearly buckled. His daughter's handwriting scratched into the stone with a nail or a piece of broken glass. She'd been here in this tunnel knowing what was waiting for her, but still thinking of him in her final moments. "Thomas Morrison, age 4, tell Sarah I was brave." The words blurred together as tears filled Caleb's eyes. His children had faced their end with more courage than most grown men could muster. They had died thinking of each other, died believing that somehow their father would find these messages and know that they had been brave. Mara took his hand and squeezed it gently. When he looked at her, she mouthed a single word: "Together." They were in this together now, two damaged souls bound by shared loss and a common purpose. Whatever was waiting for them in the church above, they would face it side by side. The tunnel ended in a narrow stone staircase that wound upward into darkness. Murphy's lantern illuminated a heavy wooden door at the top, its surface scarred with age and bearing the faint outline of a cross. "This is it," Murphy whispered. "Church basement. But we don't know what's waiting on the other side." Caleb listened carefully, but heard nothing from beyond the door. No voices, no movement, just the oppressive silence of a place where too many innocents had died. "I'll go first," he said, checking his rifle one final time. "If it's clear, I'll signal. If not, we all go in together," Murphy said firmly. "I've spent too many years looking the other way, Morrison. Tonight we make it right." The door opened without a sound, revealing a basement that was even worse than Mara's drawings had suggested. The room was larger than it had appeared in her sketches, with dozens of small alcoves carved into the walls. Each alcove contained a tiny grave, marked only by a number scratched into the stone. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, but it was the center of the room that made Caleb's blood freeze. A large wooden table stained dark with substances he didn't want to identify. Restraints hung from its edges, sized for small hands and feet. Around the table, the floor was covered with symbols, the same twisted cross that had been branded into Mara's shoulder, carved into the tree above his children's grave. This was where they had died. All of them. Tortured, broken, and finally murdered in the shadow of God's house. Mara moved through the room like a ghost, her fingers trailing over the numbered graves. She stopped at number 17, her hand flat against the stone. Her lips moved silently, and Caleb realized she was saying goodbye to someone she had known, someone she had been forced to watch die. "We need to document this," Doc Henley said, his medical training overriding his horror. "Photographs, measurements, evidence that can't be denied or explained away." But before anyone could respond, they heard footsteps on the floor above. Heavy boots moving with purpose. Creed's men had found them. "The graves," Reverend Walsh whispered urgently. "We have to open them, show the world what's been hidden here." Murphy was already moving his powerful hands, tearing at the loose stones that covered the nearest grave. What he revealed made them all step back in horror. Small bones still wrapped in the tattered remains of children's clothing. A tiny wooden cross identical to the ones Doc Henley had been carving. The footsteps above grew louder, accompanied by voices. Creed himself, Caleb realized, giving orders to his men. They had minutes, maybe less, before the basement would be swarming with killers. The tunnel. Mayor Fitzgerald said, his face pale as death. We should go back and get help. No, Caleb said firmly. This ends here, tonight. We're not running anymore. Mara tugged at his sleeve, pointing to a narrow staircase that led up to the main floor of the church. She mimed climbing, then pointed to herself. She wanted to go up to face her tormentors directly. Too dangerous, Caleb said. They'll kill you on sight. But Mara was already moving toward the stairs, her jaw set with the same determination he'd seen when she'd first written her name on his cabin floor. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She was going to make them look at what they'd done, force them to acknowledge the children they'd murdered. The main floor of the church was lit by dozens of candles, their flickering light casting long shadows across the wooden pews. At the altar, Marshal Jeremiah Creed stood like a twisted parody of a preacher, his arms spread wide as he addressed a congregation of his most trusted deputies. Gentlemen. He was saying, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. We have a problem. Our operation has been compromised by a traumatized girl and a grieving father. But problems, as you know, can be solved. Caleb counted 8 men in the church, all armed, all positioned to control the exits. Creed had planned this carefully, a final confrontation in the very place where he'd committed his greatest crimes. The girl must die. Creed continued. Morrison, too, and anyone who's helped them. But their deaths must serve a greater purpose. We'll stage it as a final, desperate act by dangerous fugitives who took hostages before being put down by lawful authority. One of the deputies shifted uncomfortably. Marshal, some of the townspeople are starting to ask questions. The doc's gone missing and Murphy's place is shot to hell. Maybe you should remember your place, Creed said coldly. And remember what happens to men who lose their nerve. The deputy fell silent, but Caleb could see the fear in his eyes. Creed ruled through terror, keeping his men in line through a combination of bribery and threats. But fear was a double-edged weapon pushed too hard, and it could turn back on its wielder. That's when Mara stepped out of the shadows at the back of the church. She moved slowly down the center aisle, her torn clothes and visible injuries making her look like a spirit risen from the grave. The deputies turned to look at her, their guns coming up, but something in her bearing made them hesitate. She was no longer the terrified girl who had clawed at Caleb's door in the snow. She was something else now, a living reminder of every innocent life that had been taken in this place, every child who had died screaming for their parents, while monsters wearing badges stood by and watched. Mara Pike. Creed said, his voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. I have to admit, I'm impressed. You've caused me more trouble than any 10 men. But your escape ends here. Mara continued, walking, her eyes fixed on Creed's face. When she reached the front pew, she stopped and turned to face the assembled deputies. Then she opened her mouth and spoke her first words in 3 years. I remember all their names. Her voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse from disuse and trauma, but it carried in the silence of the church like a thunderclap. Several of the deputies stepped back, their faces pale with shock. Sarah Morrison, Thomas Morrison, Jenny Walsh, Billy Chen, Maria Santos. She continued reciting names, each one hitting the assembled men like a physical blow. These weren't just victims to her. They were friends, companions, and suffering children she had watched die while being powerless to save them. Enough, Creed snarled, drawing his pistol. I should have killed you years ago instead of trying to break you. You tried. Mara said, her voice growing stronger with each word. But you failed. You broke my voice, but not my memory. You broke my body, but not my spirit. And you broke my brother, but even that didn't last. She held up her hand, showing a small piece of wood, Jonas's deputy badge stained with his blood. He remembered at the end. He remembered who he used to be, who I used to be. He died protecting children instead of killing them. Creed's face twisted with rage. Jonas Pike was weak. Just like his father was weak, just like his whole worthless family was weak. But weakness can be bred out given enough pressure. I thought I'd succeeded with him, but clearly I was mistaken. He raised his gun, pointing it directly at Mara's head. No more mistakes. That's when Caleb made his move. He came through the side door of the church, like an avenging angel, his Winchester speaking death before he was fully through the doorway. His first shot took down the deputy guarding the entrance. His second sent another man spinning into the pews. The third shot was aimed at Creed himself, but the Marshal had anticipated the attack and was already diving for cover behind the altar. "Kill them all," Creed screamed from his hiding place. Every last one of them. The church erupted into violence. Deputies fired from behind pews, while Murphy and the others poured through the basement entrance, their makeshift weapons no match for professional gunfighters, but their fury more than compensating for their lack of equipment. Caleb threw himself across the aisle, tackling Mara to the floor as bullets whined overhead. She'd found her voice, but she might not live long enough to use it again if they didn't end this quickly. "The altar," he shouted over the gunfire. "Creed's behind the altar." But Creed was already moving, using a hidden passage that led from behind the altar to the bell tower above. The man was a survivor, and he wasn't going to make the mistake of getting cornered in his own church. Murphy's shillelagh connected with a deputy's skull, dropping the man like a sack of grain. Doc Henley, proving that his medical training included battlefield medicine, put 2 bullets from his Derringer into another deputy's shoulder, ending that man's contribution to the fight. But there were still too many of them, and Creed's men were better armed and better positioned. Caleb could see the tide of battle turning against them, could see the inevitable end approaching. They had exposed the truth, but they weren't going to live to see justice done. That's when the unexpected happened. The main doors of the church burst open, and a flood of townspeople poured in. Men, women, even older children, all armed with whatever they could find. Pickaxes, hunting rifles, pitchforks, and raw fury at what had been done in their name. At their head was someone Caleb hadn't expected to see, Deputy Mills, his arm in a makeshift sling, but his face set with determination. Behind him came others that Caleb recognized: Mrs. Henderson from the general store, carrying her late husband's cavalry saber. Young Pete Murphy, the saloon owner's son, wielding a double-barreled shotgun with the confidence of a man who'd grown up hunting. Even old Preacher Johnson, despite his 70 years, hefting a war club that looked like it had seen service in the Indian Wars. "I heard the shooting," Mills said grimly as he moved to Caleb's side. "Figured it was time to choose a side." The remaining deputies, faced with what amounted to a popular uprising, began to lose their nerve. These weren't faceless victims. They could disappear in the night, and these were their neighbors, their customers, people they saw every day. Shooting them down would make the deputies nothing more than mass murderers, and even Creed's gold wasn't worth that. One by one, they began to lay down their weapons. But Creed himself was still at large, still dangerous. And from somewhere above them came the sound of the church bell beginning to toll, not the measured peals of a call to worship, but the frantic clanging of a man in his final desperate hour. "He's in the bell tower," Mara said, her voice clear, now strong with purpose. "There's a way out up there, a rope line that leads to the old mine. If he reaches it—" "He won't," Caleb said grimly. "This ends here." The narrow staircase that led to the bell tower was barely wide enough for one person, and it spiraled upward through the heart of the church's wooden frame. Each step creaked under Caleb's weight, and he knew that Creed would hear him coming. But surprise was no longer an option. This was going to be settled the old-fashioned way, face to face with the truth as the only weapon that mattered. The bell tower was a small wooden platform surrounded by open archways that looked out over the entire town of Bitterpine. The great bronze bell hung silent now, but the rope that had made it toll was still swinging gently in the night breeze. Marshal Jeremiah Creed stood at the far edge of the platform, a coiled rope in his hands. The zip line that would carry him to safety was already rigged, stretching out into the darkness toward the mine where his other victims waited. All he had to do was step off the platform and slide down into the night, leaving Bitterpine and all his crimes behind. But he turned to face Caleb instead, his gun drawn but not yet aimed. "Morrison," he said calmly, "I suppose I should thank you. You've given me an excuse to start fresh somewhere else with a new identity and enough gold to live comfortably for the rest of my days." "The children," Caleb said. "All those innocents. How could you?" Creed shrugged as if they were discussing the weather. "Supply and demand, Morrison. Simple economics. There are men in the territorial capital, men with appetites that can't be satisfied through conventional means. They were willing to pay handsomely for what I could provide, and small towns like Bitterpine produce a steady stream of disposable assets." Disposable assets. Caleb's voice was thick with disgust. They were children, someone's daughters and sons. They were resources to be harvested. Creed corrected. "Just like silver from the mines, or timber from the forests. You frontier folk are so sentimental about these things. It's inefficient." Behind Caleb, he could hear footsteps on the stairs. Mara was coming up along with some of the others. The confrontation was about to become very public, very final. "You know I can't let you leave," Caleb said. "And you know I can't let you live," Creed replied. "So I suppose we have ourselves a classic frontier standoff. How delightfully traditional." That's when Mara's voice carried up from the stairwell, clear and strong. "Tell him about the others, Marshal. Tell him about the men in the capital who pay for children." Creed's face went pale. "Shut up, girl. You don't know what you're talking about." But Mara was on the platform now, stepping into the moonlight, with her chin raised and her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "Judge Harrison pays the most," she said. "He likes them young and scared. Senator Williams prefers boys, and Territorial Governor Pierce, he's the one who started it all." "You're lying," Caleb said, but his voice carried no conviction. The scope of the conspiracy was too large, too perfectly organized to be the work of one corrupt marshal in a frontier town. "She's not lying," Creed said with a bitter laugh. "Did you really think this was just about Bitterpine? There are a dozen towns like this across the territory, all feeding the appetites of men with real power. I'm just a middleman, Morrison. Kill me, and 2 more will take my place by the end of the month." The enormity of it hit Caleb like a physical blow. Sarah and Thomas hadn't been random victims of local corruption. They had been deliberately selected, processed, and delivered to monsters who wore the clothes of civilization. "But there's something our little canary hasn't told you." Creed continued, his voice taking on a poisonous tone. "Something about how cooperative she was, how eager to please. Did you know she helped us catch other children? Oh yes, she was quite the asset, until she developed an inconvenient conscience." Mara's face crumpled with shame and pain. "He made me," she whispered. "He said if I helped, he wouldn't hurt them as much. But he lied. He always lied." Caleb felt his heart break for her, a child forced to make impossible choices to bear guilt that belonged to the men who had tormented her. But Creed wasn't finished with his cruelty. "Your precious children were particularly difficult," he told Caleb with a cruel smile. "The boy cried for his papa and the girl tried to protect him. Such touching family loyalty. It's a shame you weren't there to protect them when it mattered." The rage that filled Caleb was white-hot pure and absolutely focused. His Winchester came up fast, faster than he'd ever moved in his life. But Creed had been expecting the reaction, and his own gun was already in motion. 2 shots rang out in the night, echoing across Bitterpine like thunder. Creed staggered backward, a red stain spreading across his chest. But his shot had found its mark too. Caleb felt the bullet tear through his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him to his knees on the wooden platform. The marshal looked down at his wound with something like surprise. Then at the smoking gun in Mara's hands, a small derringer she'd taken from one of the fallen deputies below. Her shot had been true, punching through Creed's heart with the accuracy born of years of desperate practice in the darkness below the church. "For Sarah," she said quietly. "For Thomas. For all of them." Creed tried to say something, but blood filled his mouth instead of words. He took a step backward, then another, until he reached the edge of the platform. For a moment he teetered there, his arms windmilling as he fought for balance. Then he felt his body tumbling through the darkness to land with a wet thud in the churchyard below. Mara dropped the derringer and rushed to Caleb's side, her hands pressing against his wounded shoulder to stem the bleeding. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice thick with concern. "I'll live," Caleb said, though the pain was considerable. "What about you? Are you all right?" She considered the question for a long moment, looking out over the town where she'd suffered so much, but where she'd also found the strength to fight back. "I think I will be," she said finally. "For the first time in years, I think I might actually be all right." Below them, the people of Bitterpine were emerging from their homes and businesses, drawn by the sound of gunfire and the tolling of the church bell. They gathered in the street, looking up at the bell tower, where their nightmare had finally come to an end. Doc Henley was the first to reach them, his medical bag in hand, and his face grim with professional concern. Behind him came Murphy Deputy Mills and dozens of other people who had found the courage to stand up to evil when it mattered most. "Is it over?" someone called from below. Mara looked at Caleb, then at the crowd of faces turned up toward them. She took a deep breath and raised her voice so that everyone could hear. "Marshal Creed is dead," she announced. "But this isn't over. There are others powerful men in the territorial capital who pay for children to be taken from their families. They think they're safe behind their wealth and position. But they're wrong." She paused, her hand finding Caleb's and squeezing it tight. "We're going to expose all of them, every last one. And we're going to make sure the children they murdered are remembered, honored, and mourned properly." A cheer went up from the crowd below, not celebration exactly, but something deeper. Relief, perhaps, or the first stirring of hope after years of living under the shadow of corruption and fear. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Federal marshals arrived from the territorial capital, summoned by telegrams that Deputy Mills had sent to every law enforcement office within 100 miles. With them came newspaper reporters, territorial officials, and eventually a judge who wasn't on Creed's payroll. The basement of the church was excavated under federal supervision, revealing the full scope of the horror that had been hidden there. 23 small graves, each containing the remains of a child who had been stolen from their family and used as a commodity in the most depraved trade imaginable. Mara testified before a grand jury, her voice growing stronger with each session, as she recounted not just what had been done to her, but what she had witnessed being done to others. Her testimony was corroborated by Doc Henley, who produced detailed records he had kept of every child brought to him for medical treatment over the past 5 years. The investigation that followed reached all the way to the territorial capital and beyond. Judge Harrison was arrested at his home. Senator Williams was found dead in his office with a gun in his hand and a note confessing to his crimes, and Territorial Governor Pierce disappeared entirely, fleeing west toward California with a federal warrant hanging over his head. But for Caleb and Mara, the real work was more personal. They spent weeks in the church basement, carefully exhuming each small grave and identifying its occupant. Doc Henley's records helped, as did Mara's remarkable memory for faces and names. One by one, the children were given back their identities, their stories, their dignity. Sarah and Thomas Morrison were buried together in a small plot behind the new church that was built to replace the corrupted one. Their headstone was simple granite, but the words carved into it spoke of love that transcended death. Beloved children, taken too soon, but never forgotten. The other children received similar honors. The entire town turned out for each funeral, creating a procession of grief and remembrance that stretched on for days. Families that had spent years not knowing what had happened to their missing children finally had closure, and a community that had lived under the shadow of fear finally began to heal. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer. The trials continued in the territorial capital, but Bitterpine itself began to transform. New businesses opened, new families moved in, and the town slowly shed its reputation as a place where children disappeared and no one asked questions. Caleb found work as the town's new sheriff, a position he accepted reluctantly, but with the understanding that Bitterpine needed someone who understood the cost of corruption. His first official act was to deputize Mara Pike, making her the first female law enforcement officer in the territory's history. There were some who objected to a girl barely out of her teens wearing a badge, but those objections died quickly when they saw the steel in her eyes and the steady way she carried herself. Mara had seen evil in its purest form and had survived it. There wasn't much in the way of frontier crime that could intimidate her after what she'd endured. On a warm day in late summer, nearly a year after that terrible night in the snow, Caleb found Mara in the cemetery behind the new church. She was kneeling beside a fresh grave, placing wildflowers on the mound of earth that marked Jonas Pike's final resting place. "I come here every week," she said without looking up. "I tell him about the town, about the trials, about the children we've saved. I think he would be proud of what we've accomplished." Caleb knelt beside her, his own flowers, daisies, Sarah's favorites, destined for a grave just a few rows away. "I think he would be. Your brother died protecting you, Mara. That counts for something. He died remembering who he used to be." She corrected. "That's what matters." Creed tried to erase that, tried to turn him into something he wasn't. But love is stronger than conditioning, and family is stronger than fear. They sat together in comfortable silence, two damaged souls who had found a way to honor their dead by protecting the living. Around them, the cemetery was peaceful, filled with the sound of birds and the rustle of leaves in the gentle summer breeze. "Caleb," Mara said eventually. "Yes. Do you think they know Sarah and Thomas and all the others? Do you think they know we stopped it?" Caleb considered the question carefully. He wasn't a religious man, hadn't been since the night his children died. But sitting here in this place of memory and hope, he found that he could believe in something larger than himself. "I think they know," he said. "I think they've known all along. And I think they're proud of you for finding your voice, for speaking their names when no one else would." Mara smiled, the first truly happy expression he'd seen from her since that night in the snow. "Then we've done what we came to do." As they rose to leave, Caleb noticed something he hadn't seen before. There, carved into the base of Jonas Pike's headstone, was a small symbol. Not the twisted cross that had marked Creed's victims, but something else. A simple heart surrounded by tiny stars. "Mara," he said, "did you carve that?" She shook her head, her eyes bright with wonder. "No, but I know what it is. It's the symbol Jonas and I used to carve into trees when we were children to mark our special places. He must have. Someone must have." She trailed off, but Caleb understood. Love had found a way to survive, even Creed's attempts to destroy it. Family bonds had proven stronger than torture and conditioning. And in the end, the children had been remembered not as victims, but as individuals who had mattered, who had been loved, who had left marks on the world that could never be completely erased. They walked back toward town together, their badges glinting in the afternoon sun. Behind them, the cemetery rested in peaceful silence, a place where memory and hope coexisted, where the dead were honored, and the living found the strength to continue. But there was one more surprise waiting for them. As they reached the main street of Bitterpine, They found a crowd gathered around the new town sign that had been erected to replace the old one damaged in the riots. The sign was beautiful, carved from local oak and painted in bright colors that seemed to glow in the summer light. "Welcome to Bitterpine." The sign read, "A community built on truth," but it was what was carved below the main text that made Mara catch her breath. There, in elegant script, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, were names. Dozens of names. Every child who had died in Creed's basement, every innocent who had been stolen from their families and used as currency in the most evil trade imaginable. Sarah Morrison, Thomas Morrison, Jonas Pike, all of them remembered forever. "Who did this?" Mara whispered. Murphy stepped out of the crowd, his weathered face creased with emotion. "We all did, lass. Every family that lost someone, every person who lived with the fear. We worked on it together in secret so that no one would ever forget what was lost here." He handed Mara a small wooden tool, a carving knife, worn smooth by use. "But there's one name missing. One name that deserves to be there more than any other." Mara looked at the knife and then at the crowd of faces surrounding her. These were her people now, her family, her community. They had all suffered under Creed's rule, and they had all found the courage to fight back when it mattered most. Slowly, carefully, she carved her own name into the wood below the others. Not as a victim, but as a survivor. Not as someone who had been silenced, but as someone who had found her voice and used it to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. When she was finished, she stepped back and looked at the sign. It was more than just a marker for a town. It was a promise, a vow that the children would never be forgotten, that their voices would continue to echo through the generations. As the sun set over Bitterpine, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mara Pike stood surrounded by her adopted family and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace that comes from remembering well, from honoring the dead, by living fully, from finding hope in the darkest places. The children were safe now, all of them, and their voices would never be silenced again. In the gathering dusk, if you listened carefully, you might have heard something carried on the evening breeze, not quite singing, not quite speaking, but something in between. The sound of young voices raised in harmony, telling stories, sharing secrets, laughing at jokes only they understood. It was the sound of memory made manifest, of love that transcends death, of justice that reaches beyond the grave. It was the sound of children who would never truly be gone as long as someone remembered their names. And in Bitterpine, someone always would. The voices of the innocent echo through eternity, carried on the winds of memory, and sustained by the courage of those who refused to let them be forgotten. Enhanced Edition, Wild West Tale of Justice and Remembrance.